Hey everybody, welcome back. I've been giving you a lot of code over the last few classes that I have written. You spent the last couple of weeks of class working with code that I have written to do a number of things. So this is a motorized arm simulation that you've used to play around with control algorithms. You've used Vex VR to build a virtual robot. And you've also played around with my spacecraft code to try to autonomously land a spacecraft yourself. The basis of all of these has been the concept of libraries and APIs, which I'm going to describe as we get started today. And the most important thing that I want you to understand about libraries and APIs is that they represent code that is designed to be used by other people. I have written this code in order to give you a learning experience to understand a bit about control algorithms. And so to do that, I have had to write libraries that you have been able to use and also APIs to make it so that you understand how to use the code that I've given you. VexVR has a whole bunch of functions that you're able to just use right out of the box. And so you can go to this list of functions on the left-hand side of the screen and just use them. And if you click on the question mark, it'll give you information about the function that you're trying to use. So it tells you what each function does, it tells you the inputs, it tells you the outputs, if there are outputs, and it gives you instructions on how to use it. This line of code right here at the top, from VEX code import star, it means to bring in all of this code that the engineers at VexVR have built for you, bring it in so that you have access to the capabilities that that code gives you in VexVR. For the automated water valve that you worked on, I told you that there were two things that you could actually control in the code. One was by taking this mywatervalve.getFlowRate, you could get what my simulated sensor was reading within the control algorithm. There was another thing that you could do, and that was this mywatervalve.setSignal, which was the signal that you send to that valve in order to either make it fully open or fully closed. And that's what we used to control the flow rate. Those were the only two functions that you needed to use in that library. There was a lot of code in there. In fact, this is the full code that I wrote for that water valve. You can see the set signal function is here. You can also see the get flow rate is a function that I've written here in Python. But there's a bunch. There's this right here. There's all of this stuff that's built into that code that for you doesn't actually matter, because this other code, it's contained within the library itself, and you don't interact with it directly because it's inside the library. The way that you interact with this library are using these two functions, that was setSignal and getFlowRate. It's important to know in a set of code that you're given, what code are you meant to use as a programmer, and what code is contained within the library so that it works as intended, but maybe isn't necessary for a user who just wants to use the library itself. You just wanted to be able to read the simulated sensor and control the valve. You didn't need to know any of these other details. I also showed you this Spacecraft Engine API, and I use this abbreviation API without really talking much about it. But the idea behind it was I wanted you to know exactly what you could access within this engine. So I told you could get data of the spacecraft, how high it was, how fast it was moving, what was the acceleration. I also had code in there that would make it so that it would update over time. And you had this myrocket.setThrust so that you could control how much power that engine was actually using to force the spacecraft up if it was launching, or turn it off entirely and just let the spacecraft fall back to Earth. And then there were these other functions that were useful within my program. You didn't have to use them, but they were there available to you. With all of these examples, I want to give you a definition of what I mean by libraries and an API. A library is a collection of code that is written with the specific purpose of being used in other programs. We write lots of code that only we are going to use ourselves. A library is meant for other people to use so that it makes their lives easier. But if I want to save you time, I'm not just going to give you my library and hope that you're going to read through the entire thing and figure out what it does. To truly save you time, I should really give you the information you need to know how to interact with the code I've written. There were two functions that I actually needed to tell you about, and that was the set signal and also the get flow rate. This gets to the idea of an API, an abbreviation which stands for Application Programming Interface. And an API is the set of instructions and guidelines and details for actually using the code within that programmer library. It's the user manual. It tells you what's possible, it tells you what kinds of variables you might need to use, and also tells you what kind of errors you might run into as you are using that library and its capabilities within your own code. Here in VexCode VR, if you click on the question mark, as I was alluding to earlier, it gives you the information on the right-hand side. It tells you how to use it. It says, this is what the function does, some of these details about running the drivetrain forever. It tells you a default value, and it also gives you some example code so that you understand how to use it. This is a library for an ultrasonic sensor that we have in the Idea Center. And if you look on the side, it says API reference, so this code that tells you how to actually use it. And there are only two things in this, or three things actually, in this API that you can look at. It tells you how to create a Python object within the code to read the sensor. So you can see that here in this line of the code, sonar equals all of this. This is a sensor that measures range using ultrasonic sound. And so it tells you that if you want to read the distance, you just have to get the property right out of the library. And it's much easier to look at the API than it is to look at the library itself. Just to prove this to you, we're going to look at the code in the library. This is the code in the GitHub repository for the sensor driver. And you can see it does have some comments that explain what the sensor does, what it's for, but there's a lot here. It has some code here that creates the sensor itself, enter, exit, these things which you don't really need to know about. And then it has this property, which is what we saw in the API, that shows how you may want to actually read the sensor. And it has some other stuff in there too. But really, the API is the place to go because it tells you how to use the sensor. What I'm going to be looking for you to do over the next couple of classes is become comfortable with looking at the API for specific libraries and be able to describe some of the capabilities of a particular library by reading that API. So let's get started with some activities that'll get you learning how to do that.